Okay, thank you. In my talk, I will broaden my perspective from Du Châtelet going forward. And what I want to do is, you see it here, to shed a new light on the old debate on determinism in the light of principles and hypotheses by a comparison between Du Châtelet, Laplace and Somerville. My talk is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I will give you a short overview of well-known conventional objections against determinism, including my own appraisal of how to deal with them. In the second part, I'm pursuing the historical roots of the discussion about determinism that lie in the idea of principle of sufficient reason. And in the third part, I present 2 examples, the law of inertia and the principle of least action. And these examples not only help to underpin the important role of the interplay between principles and hypotheses as a tool for testing and probing physical theories, but allow to dissolve the faint opposite of determinism and indeterminism into the overall perspective of symmetry and symmetry breaking. So it's a commonplace that asking the right question will help you to find a solution. Half the battle is learning to spot a problem with clarity. So what's the right question about determinism? Is it the right question to ask whether determinism is true or false? Or how could we ever decide whether the world is deterministic or not? Which world? Our world? Asking the question, one would think that it should be at least a clearly decidable problem. If not, would it better to ask why we should care and philosophize about determinism? Well, the aim of my talk is not to prove or to disprove determinism. Neither I will end with the result that the question about determinism makes no sense. My aim is to improve a deeper understanding of the ongoing debate on the status of meaning, scopes and limits of determinism. Consider the following statement. The law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. This assessment does not come from me. It's a quote made by Ayn Rand, a Russian-born American philosopher of the 20th century. Franz Kickelben, having written for the Skeptic magazine and published academic articles on determinism and time travel, harshly criticized Ayn Rand's views on causation. I quote, Rand's views on causation contradict her views on free will. The reason is very simple. Her views on causation are those of a determinist. Her views on free will, however, make her a libertarian. And those 2 positions are, by definition, incompatible. Furthermore, it is simply false that determinism follows from the law of identity. Is this criticism justified? My answer is no, it isn't. Ayn Rand's statement neither claims that determinism follows from the law of identity, nor that causation necessarily coincides with determinism. Of course, the core idea of determinism is closely related to the idea of causality, but this does not mean that determinism means the same. There are several ways in which determinism could be spelled out without the involvement of causation, and the other way around, we can analyze causality without referring to determinism. So 2 well-known examples, chaos in physics indicates that deterministic computability is not satisfied in a class of nonlinear equations. Nevertheless, they are well-defined causal relationships. And of course, quantum mechanics does not go so far as to say that events have absolutely no causal connections. but it introduced events with a statistical cause. So fact is that today we are confronted with a variety of deterministic and indeterministic models and theories, depending on what conditions are considered. So what? Are we left alone with a plurality of determinisms and indeterminisms, the one just as good as the other or equally bad? I think Franz Kigelben is right. Before proceeding, it might be a good idea to define the term determinism. According to Kigelben, determinism is the view that the future is close to all but one possibility. Libertarianism is the view that we have free will, and that since free will is incompatible with determinism, determinism is false. Of course, everyone is free to define determinism in this way. But the crucial question is whether or not this definition gives us the necessary and sufficient conditions for determinism. So, I think it's helpful to look back to the history. The roots of the notion lie in a very common philosophical idea, the idea that everything can, in principle, be explained, or that everything that is has a sufficient reason for being as it is, and not otherwise. In other words, the roots of determinism lie in what Leibniz named the principle of sufficient reason. But of course, the idea that nothing is without reason or without cause, or that everything must have a reason or a cause, was conceived by various philosophers who preceded Leibniz, including the Greek philosophers Anaximander, Parmenides, Archimedes, Aristotle. So I don't want to go in detail in the different meanings of the principle of sufficient reason in Leibniz philosophy. So the point I'm focusing on is the following one. The principle of sufficient reason has been used more or less tacitly in almost all classical physics of the so-called Newtonian type. Read, for example, Laplace or Lagrange. But the principle was of no importance for Newton himself. Why? My answer is this has at least two reasons, a historical and political and a methodological reason. Both are made out in the name of Émilie du Châtelet. As well known, du Châtelet made an important contribution to bring Newton's Philosophia Naturalis to the attention of a wide variety of philosophers and physicists. In fact, she did much more than that. Her aim was to correct and to generalize Newton's laws. And even more than that, du Châtelet Borgram was not only an outcome of her lifelong struggle with the theories of Descartes, Newton, and Leibniz, searching for a way to combine them. Her philosophy was based on the conviction that science is a kind of construction business in a twofold sense, as the act of a building and how building was built. Construction starts with planning, and a plan is a necessary but not sufficient condition for successful construction. A perfect plan would be useless if it is not possible to realize this plan, whereas actualization means realization of a potential in a particular concrete form. So du Châtelet's architectural plan was pursuing two tasks. The first task refers to the foundation of a building, and the second task, that means framing hypothesis, refers to the scaffolding of a building. And the foundations of building are given by the two principles, the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. At a first look, this building metaphor seems to anticipate the modern distinction between the validation of a theory, the context of justification, and its development and construction, the context of discovery. but that would sort and simplify Du Châtelet's picture of the dynamic interplay between both tasks. Perhaps inspired from Wolff or others, Du Châtelet defined possibility as that which does not involve a contradiction. In other words, possibility is defined as consistency. Consequently, impossibility is that which involves a contradiction. Possibility taken as consistency ensures existence. It is the very root of existence. In this way, and this is why the possibles are commonly called beings. We commonly speak, of course, of beings past, present, future, and past, of beings that no longer exist or that do not yet exist. In any case, their being has nothing to do with actual existence. It is, so merely possible being, yet a being. So, therefore, a full understanding of the actual must go beyond the principle of contradiction to include an explanation of why this possible rather than another is actual. And this further explanation is what is demanded by the principle of sufficient reason, according to my understanding of Du Châtelet. We navigate our way through the world as we find it in all its possibilities, complexities, with the help of the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. They function like Ariadne's thread in the labyrinth of knowledge and help to find solution to given problems by testing hypotheses. Our search for understanding will never come to an end, and we always have the challenge of new discovery. None of us has a perfectly distinct and godlike understanding of the whole. The ability to compute and to cite all problems once and for all reserves to the eternal geometry. So, exactly this passage in the Institution was quoted by Charles Bonnet in his work about Leibniz, and this passage was or influenced Laplace, who was very influenced by Charles Bonnet in general. And what Laplace did, he modified and interpreted the idea of an eternal geometry, which is much older than Du Châtelet, into his own picture of an omniscient intelligence. I'm sure you all know the famous passage from his essay on probability, where Laplace says, we ought then to regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its anterior state and the cause of the one which is to follow, given for one instant an intelligence which could comprehend all the forces by which nature is animated and the respective situation of the beings who compose it, an intelligence sufficiently vast to submit this data to analysis. It would be embraced in the same formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the lightest atom. For it, nothing would be uncertain, and the future as past would be present in its eyes. Oh, end of the quote. It was no accident that Laplace referred at the same side or passage to the principle of sufficient reason. Laplace insisted, as Leibniz, Du Châtelet, and a lot of others also did, that the principle of sufficient reason is without exception. But Laplace went beyond his predecessors, bringing together the principle of sufficient reason, determinism, and a conception of probability as relative in part to our ignorance. Now, Laplace was well aware of the fact that we are often ignorant of the ways an event can occur, and therefore have no reason to believe that one way will occur preferentially compared to the other. However, the lack of knowledge about how something is caused does not mean that it is uncaused. Laplace argued that chance did not really exist. Whether or not this conclusion is justified, I don't want to discuss here. He said, that's the point, chance is the result of our ignorance, a reflection of the limitations of our intelligence. And this was summarized by John Playfair in his review, 1840, in the following words. It is to the imperfection of the human mind and not to any irregularity in nature of things that our ideas of chance and probability are to be referred. So Laplace's so-called clockwork image of the cosmos, based on the picture of a universal, omnipresent and omniscient intelligence, has become the major paradigm of 19th century physics. But at the same time it comes under attack. Why? Of course, Laplace's intelligence is an unprovable and untestable assumption, representing an internal and static being beyond space and time. Laplace probably had God in mind as the powerful intelligence, but the real problem regarding to physics was a deeper one. In contrast to the manifest irreversibility of nearly all systems we observe in nature, the basic dynamical laws of physics are time reversible. For a wide class of physical theories, if they can be viewed as deterministic at all, they can be viewed as bidirectionally deterministic. That is, a specification of a state of the world at a given time along with the laws determines not only how things go after, but also how things go before. In contrast, we tend to think of the past as done, over, fixed and beyond our control. Forward-looking determinism then entails that these past states determine everything we do in our lives. It then seems a mercurious fact that it is equally true that the state of the world now determines everything that happened in the past. So we have an ingrained habit of taking the direction of both causation and explanation as being past-present, even when discussing physical theories, free of any such asymmetry, perhaps. However, at this point it is useful to look back to Laplace. He said we ought to regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its antecedent state and as the cause of the state that is followed. But how to derive the predictability and reproducibility of the future and past states of the whole universe from present boundary conditions? If one defines determinism as universal causal connectedness for all events, then predictability does not follow. Nothing is said about the future states of the whole universe. How then could Laplace set up such a thesis? Here differential equations are of particular importance. These equations determine the system's behavior insofar as from a given set of antecedent conditions, a set of consequence conditions can be derived. But the further step to any causal inferences can only be achieved by means of additional assumptions, for example, about space and time and motion. Given such premises, the leading question is then whether for each initial condition there exists a unique solution of these equations. Here again it turns out that the answer depends on what kind of differential equations one considers. This is a crucial problem. Despite the common belief that classical mechanics is perfectly deterministic, in fact the theory is rife with possibilities for determinism to break down relative to the presupposed assumption. So what follows for the principle of sufficient reason? No? And here, okay, this is not mal the Laplacian determinism. And now I want to give you two examples. Newton's axioms of motion, here in the Latin original of the third edition, appeared 1726. And Du Châtelet has given a loose translation, modification and interpretation of Newton's axioms in your Institution and later in his translation of the Principia. So I will come then back. And I just will summarize it here, what Du Châtelet did. She replaces in the first law the word force by the word cause. I'm very sorry, I have a tip failure. This means cause, I have forgotten. See? My God, it was late. The CA is on the other side. Okay, I'm very sorry. Oh. Okay. And is preserved? That's correct. Okay. So she does not write that everybody perceives in its state of being at rest or of moving uniformly straightforward, except insofar as it is compelled to change its state by force impressed. She says that everybody perceives in its state of being at rest or of moving uniformly straightforward, except insofar as it is compelled to change its state by a cause. And in the second law, Du Châtelet omits the word impressed. She does not maintain that the alteration of motion is proportional to the motive force impressed. She only speaks about motive force. And further, Du Châtelet adds that the note that otherwise the change of motion of a body would happen without sufficient reason. Newton himself interpreted the inertial force as an inert force, and the inert force as a passive principle by which bodies persist in their motion or rest. Inertia tends to preserve motion. For every change in motion, Newton argued an active principle is necessary, that means impressed force. Newton's distinction between vis incita and vis impressa in the definitions of the Principia may be called the philosophical basis of the whole work, because it connects the nature of matter with its operation, the genesis of changes in its states. Without vis incita, there is nothing in any particle of matter on which vis impressa can operate, and moreover, nothing which can be exercised as vis impressa in reaction upon that operation. So, what Du Châtelet wanted to do is to show that it's possible that the principle of sufficient reason can be applied and to Newton's axioms. In short, if there is no sufficient reason for one thing to happen instead of another, the principle says that nothing happens, the initial situation does not change, or everybody perceives in its state of being. But there is something more to say, I think. In the absence of a cause, the initial state, the symmetry, is preserved. Symmetry cannot happen without a reason, or asymmetry cannot originate spontaneously. The law of inertia is insofar encoded into a symmetry principle, insofar as it refers to an equivalence of all states of uniform motion, usually called Galilean invariance. This is my own interpretation. And I hope you understand at the end of my talk why. Here's my second example. There's only a... So, Newton's laws define the relation between force, mass, and motion. They are generally used to determine an object's path under a given force. Now it can be shown, as you all know, that these axioms follows as a consequence of the principle of least action. The principle of least action is a variational principle. It states that the path of a moving object can be found by minimizing the object's action. Action is described as an integral used to determine the evolution of a physical system between two defined states. More precisely, it is a formulation of the equations of motion for physical system, not as differential equations, but as an integral equation using the calculus of variations. Oh. Suppose a particle moving from one point to another, given in magnitude but not in direction. Suppose also that it is urged by accelerating forces. We can then determine the velocity of the particle without knowing the curve described by the particle in moving from A to B. This is a quotation you can find in Mary Somerville's book and translation of Laplace, Mechanism of the Heavens. Like Émilie du Châtelet's Principia translation, this book had been a massive undertaking, over 600 pages, plus a preliminary dissertation of 70 pages. It was no accident that Mary Somerville was called the Queen of Science of the 19th century. By the way, it was Somerville who introduced Ada Lovelace to Babbage and to Christine Led Franklin, who had developed a very interesting, elegant decision procedure in logic, in his algebra of logic based on the idea of impossibility proofs called antilogism. But this is only a footnote. Back to the principle of least action. So, Somerville said the principle of least action consists in this, that if the particle be free to move in every direction between these 2 points, except insofar as it obeys the action of these forces, then it will, in virtue of this action, choose the path in which the integral phi ds is a minimum, and if it be constrained to move on a given surface, it will still move in a curve in which the integral phi ds is a minimum among all those that can be traced on the surface between the given points. So, and how to prove this or to demonstrate this principle? It is required to prove the variation to be zero when A and B, the extreme points of the curve, are fixed. If the given points A and B be movable in space, the last member of this equation will determine their motion. But if they be fixed points, the last member, which is the variation of the coordinates of these points, are zero. Hence also the integral becomes zero, which indicates either a maximum or a minimum, but it is evident from the nature of the problem that it can only be a minimum. This was a problem that not only minima but other types of extremal points, saddle points for example, need to be admitted as well. It's not so innocent and evident as one might naively think. Obviously, Somerville was well aware of this problem. Nevertheless, she said it's evident from the nature of the problem that it can only be a minimum. Why? According to the widely held view, nature does work in the most economical way possible by choosing the actual path from many possible paths, read, for example, Maupertuis and so on. If the trajectory is sufficiently short, the action is a local minimum, and that means least. My opinion is that we should avoid such concepts like choosing or selecting. But what we can say is the local stationary trajectory is realized by an actualization because of the underlying invariance or symmetry of the system. I think exactly in this way Somerville argues, given velocity is constant and uniform, the particle will describe a curve in a shorter time than it would have done any other curve that could be drawn between these 2 points. End of the quote. In other words, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line which led to a minimum because of the underlying invariance. So far, so good. It is often praised that an appealing feature of the action principles is their brevity and elegance in expressing the laws of motion. And more than that, they are valid for any choice of coordinates. But this brevity and generality has its price. The principle of least action tells us nothing except that motion is determined by its initial conditions. But we need to define an appropriate space-time geometry. We need to define the concept of action, not to forget the versions of the principle of least action differ from one to each other regarding to the solution that they determine, and they are dependent on the constraints on the variation. So my conclusion is that the principle of least action can neither prove nor disprove determinism, nor the principle of sufficient reason. But this is perhaps the reason why we need hypotheses. This is a quote of the Institution. I have decided to give the English translation because I think it's very important. The philosophers frame hypothesis to explain the phenomena, the cause of which cannot be discovered either by experiments or by demonstration. This is not the understanding of hypothesis as you can find of the 19th century as empiricists. Hypotheses play more the status of an in-between status between a priori and a posteriori arguments. From a modern point of view, function like hybrids. So that perhaps we could say hypothesis would be blind without principles, and principles would be empty without hypothesis. This is the lesson we can learn, I think, from Émilie du Châtelet. My own lesson regarding to the examples and all the discussions about determinism and indeterminism in physics is search for invariances under transformations. End of the talk.
So, thank you very much. The discussion, please.
Is the last transparency devoted to Kant?
The search for invariances? No. This is, of course, I was inspired by Kant, yeah. But the other question is what Kant means by the concept of hypothesis and principles. And Kant's understanding of hypothesis is not the same as du Châtelet. And have more sympathy for du Châtelet's understanding of hypothesis. So it's inspired by Kant, of course, but only the structure, not the meaning of the concepts I used. Do you understand? I used the word hypothesis and principles, not referring to Kant, but referring to Émilie du Châtelet. Yeah, That's the main difference.
But the logical structure is very similar.
That's true, and I take it from
What
Kant.
does it mean?
I take it from Kant, yeah, because
Yeah.
yeah. Is this not allowed?
But it's allowed. Yes. This is very interesting.
So no.
May I have a further question? You discussed all the determinism and all other things for a completely created universe. And also Laplace supposed that the universe is complete. But in the very beginning, you have a phrase which is a certain contradiction. Here.
To do Châtelet.
There's a certain contradiction because you put at an element, and this means you divide the completely universe into the element and the rest. And what about the determinism in this case?
The element and the rest. What do you mean by rest?
Yeah, one element is given. One element is given and the rest of the universe is also given. But this is a division of the complete universe into two parts. And you ask, or Du Châtelet asks for the relation between the two parts. But what is the status, yes, concerning determinism of the element, and what is the status of the rest? The status should be different. Otherwise, it would be not reasonable to distinguish between the element and the universe.
This is if I understand you right, you want to say there's a main difference between Du Châtelet and Laplace? Because
no. I only ask what is the consequence from this division.
We have no complete.
You have to choose an element.
Yeah.
If an element, the state of an element is given. Yeah, how is given? The state of the universe is also given. The state of the element is given and the state of the universe is given.
Mm-hmm. And what's the relation?
Yes,
to
of course.
Okay. With respect to determinism?
Yes.
Yes.
I
think this is the crucial point, or isn't it? Because if we state that the universe is complete, then and only then determinism can work. Or incompleteness and determinism, is it possible to combine?
And the element is also incomplete, because only if the element is in the universe is complete. But you took an element, a probe particle. This is a usual method in physics, to have a probe particle, but then you have to determine the properties of this probe particle independent of the universe, because if it depends on the universe, you cannot measure the universe by means of the probe particle. You have to establish a certain independence in order to determine determinism. If the particle is not independent, you cannot.
This is very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. No, this is a very interesting interpretation of the problem of quantum mechanics, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you very much.
I have a question. As we pointed out in our talk, even I myself, there is and recently it was proven in a very influential article that Bošković had this interpreted this determinism or plus determinism put something like 60 years before Laplace actually even in a better form than Laplace, because Laplace theory, as you know, it requires both ontological and epistemological principle, and it's connected with causality and so on. Okay, and Bošković kind of reduced this explanatory factors and made it a little bit more elegant. So my question would be, would it change in your interpretation of the Chaplet, the idea or hypothesis only that she was familiar with this Portuguese text? Of course, she could not have been familiar with Laplace because she was long dead.
Yeah.
But if she were familiar with Portuguese theory of determinism, would it change anything in your interpretation of the theory?
What I want to give is just a critique of Laplace. So Laplace became very famous and very important. Everyone refers to Laplace when discussing determinism, but this is, for me, not really justified. It's I think it comes because of the dynamic of citation and the dynamic of scientific communities and so on. But what I want to do is to show you the historical material is much more richer than only referred to Laplace. It's Laplace idea of an omniscient intelligence is very naive, I think, compared to others of that time. And nevertheless, it makes interesting career in the 19th century. If you read Helmholtz or others, they all, Du Bois-Reymond and so on, they refer always to Laplace, but do not investigate the context of Laplace idea or figure. And I want to contribute that this should be done. So.
You're an expert on the Chatelet's ideas of causality and events. So if you imagine that you're familiar with some sort of deterministic concept of Laplacian, let's call it Laplacian, because not from Laplace, of course, but through other sources, would it give some sort of different reading of, for instance, her change of first law of Newton when she changes force into cause and so on? Would it give some sort of key of interpretative key to that, or not really? It doesn't change anything in understanding Du Chatelet.
It's very difficult because we have to look at so different aspects in this discussion. For example, the distinction between knowledge and what is given, or ontology and epistemology. This is a very modern distinction. So, Du Chatelet, on the one hand, emphasizes the incompleteness of our knowledge, and on the other hand, she made ontological suppositions. So it's in a way her institution here sometimes, I think, not really clear. Yeah? And on the other hand, we have Laplace, who said, the world is deterministic and independent of our knowledge, if we know it or not. This is a very clear statement, but very disputable as well. The another problem is with regarding to Newton and Newton's axioms. Of course, in the late 18th and 19th century, Newton's axioms and his mechanics were interpreted as deterministic. But Newton itself, I don't think he realized this problem. Or do you know it? Did Newton discuss the problem of determinism regarding to his?
Of course, we discussed it. Without determinism, there is no second law. You demonstrated this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Determinism in this sense.
In addition, the third law also fixes the determinism because the equality of action and reaction is considered as a universal law.
Yeah, this is very important.
Equality, not
Yeah,
only
yeah,
Was the
yeah.
determinist, but not the Châtelet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Without this equality, there is no determinism.
Yeah. So once again, we have this, how the sufficient reason is treated today. Perhaps I, however, missed now the argument, but so to put it then on the problem, so this is the Newtonian determinism, and of course, within the broad realm of Newtonian determinism, you can integrate the principle of sufficient reason. But this doesn't say anything, to the, it doesn't neither hurt, it is only one part of a greater definition of something, which remains not, because I think you integrated, you brought the principle of sufficient reason to demonstrate that she is counting on the principle of sufficient reason. You said she's using the principle of sufficient reason as a cause, as causal for a principle.
No, as a cause for a principle?
For the principle?
No, never.
No. Because I think this was very circular.
No,
it
of course.
It is the other way around, as the principle of sufficient, if it might be interpreted so far, it is a part within the wider definition.
Well, we have two possibles to use the principle of sufficient reason to integrate the principle of sufficient reason into Newtonian laws, and this is not very surprising, as I understand you.
Yes, and this is the point. It is so the principle of sufficient reason doesn't mean anything new. Then that 1 and 1 is 2, and that there is a certain system. We count that one thing happens after the other, and so on. And sometimes it seems to me like today, everybody after Habermas, everybody spoke about the discourse, but usually they meant a discussion, a dispute, or something like that. And this wasn't that time. So every argument has to be reasonable. And an argument has to follow the premise. But they all are speaking about, now, okay, and so I think this is really a problem within Du Châtelet, even when she's using the sufficient reason,
What I want to do is not to argue for the sufficient reason. By no means. I used the two examples to relativize the principle of sufficient reason, to take it from its importance. So, what I want to do is to show, look, we have two examples in physics, and much more important thing is the idea of symmetry and symmetry breaking and the invariance principle. And that what I want to do is to look at this idea, and this is the grounding idea, not the principle of sufficient reason. But I think why people use the principle of sufficient reason, whether justified or not, perhaps it was and is a stimulus for theory, for foundational and heuristic tasks, because to integrate the principle of sufficient reason into Newtonian mechanics, or the principle of least action, is only an example. Look, for example, to the importance of principle of sufficient reason in Lagrange. And he tried to prove the parallel postulate of Euclidean geometry on the basis of principle of sufficient reason. It fails, but it's very interesting because it had nothing to do, the first look, with mechanics or determinism. And group theory was discussed or developed on discussions about the principle of sufficient reason, another interesting example in the history of mathematics and physics.
But I don't want to go on to this point. You said the idea of hypothesis is different in Kant than it is in Du Châtelet.
Yeah, why? Why? Kant said in mathematics there are no place for hypotheses, and Du Châtelet denies this. They said, also in mathematics we need hypotheses.
Du Châtelet says famously that even numbers and all ways of counting are
and I think this is a very important difference to Kant.
Yeah, of course. But this is not the difference in the definition of hypothesis.
And what then?
Yeah, I ask you. But this is the difference in the application. He says hypotheses are not applicable to numbers and...
okay. So, hypothesis, if I understand Du Châtelet right, can be falsified. And principles cannot, because I think principles, according to Du Châtelet, are presumptions before you can make hypothesis. And hypotheses have now the status of these presumptions, preconditions. But I'm not sure if this is right, but then we have the important question, what's the relation between principles and hypothesis? Today we take often the view that principles have also only an hypothetical status.
Yes, however, Du Châtelet has a clear idea of a priori principle. A principle is an a priori or an universal claim. Yeah. So she differs clearly principles from hypotheses.
Yeah, this is, I think.
To a certain extent. Yeah.
I want only
Yeah.
comment
last question.
that Du Châtelet respects the principle of sufficient reason to Archimedes, not to Leibniz.
This is the point, to Archimedes and to this. She has a completely different relation.
Okay.
Everybody is saying principle of sufficient reason, but what they mean and what
But yeah, this is very...
that if there is a reason, I have to have an argument. And after the
No,
argument
that's too simple.
There is a premise, and from the premise I take a conclusion.
Frau Hadengruber,
This
this was the reason why I referred to Lagrange, because Lagrange referred to Archimedes in his discussion of the principle of sufficient reason.
But this would be worth a next next dissertation, you know, on the problem, including all the American arguments now on the sufficient reason, because this is really like in the whole world is written on. I can't find a better example than the Habermashian discourse, because even when our students are discussing now, they have a discourse, yes, independently if they have ever read Habermas or not.
I never have read
This
Habermas.
is all it. And the principle of
Sorry.
sufficient reason is nothing as in Du Châtelet, that having one argument and one reason after the other reason, and always returning to much more to the Cartesian style, yes, of giving arguments, a clear argument. She's writing on that.
Oh, and I just mentioned Leibniz in
And
a
it
footnote.
this was the sickness of König, you know, to give her, but even I think we can even show that even before König came to Cyrene, she's using here and there sufficient reason, because also Voltaire is using sufficient reason. So it was a common expression, as it is also used by Leibniz in the Leibniz Clark letters. So everybody used this damn term, and it is not dependent on the visit of König and so on. Yeah. So I have to exhaust myself on that, because I did it already yesterday, because it's incredible that how we talked about that yesterday. The American research today is fixed for a certain reason. I know for which reason, because in the Stanford Encyclopedia, all the hypotheses are explained by referring it to Wolff, the sufficient reason. And this is such a, this is a blown up contribution in my sense, because, this is much too wide and much too far from Du Châtelet's interpretation. Yeah.
So I mentioned
But there are
the
many,
Greek philosophers.
There are many many points. So another good argument, I think, determinism from every side really is interesting, because we see clearly clearly when we see her liberty talks and so on, that notion and the liberty of will, and I think she's one of the big thinkers of incompatibility, of the compatibility of physics, laws of physics, and liberty of and free will. And even here she's a precursor of Hume, in my view. And this would be much more fruitful to investigate into that. Yeah, so, yeah, okay. Now we continue with another very important,